Well, thank you very much, Sarah, for that very nice introduction. And she's arranged it through the Sheldon Memorial Trust, and I think it's a great pleasure that this is one of their activities too. Anyhow, good evening, everybody, and the subject is Jorvik at 40, Jorvik and After. And it did strike me that as we're in a festival of ideas, that it would be quite a good idea to think about the ideas that led to Jorvik, and then the ideas that Jorvik spawned elsewhere. And so this is a talk about a whole series of ideas, but there'll be something about Jorvik as we go on as well. This month is the 40th anniversary of the day on which the then Prince of Wales, now King Charles, inaugurated the Viking Centre. It wasn't the first day it opened. It opened on the 14th of April in 1984. We weren't sure that it was a good idea to have we didn't know whether it would work on the first day, and we thought, well, we'll bring the Prince along a little bit later, and we're sure it does work. It did. And since then, it's worked continuously pretty well. The odd flood now and then, and interruption that has caused the short, brief closures. Since then, in fact, nearly 25 million people have visited the Jorvik Viking Centre, and hopefully they've come away knowing something more about ancient York and about the Vikings. And hopefully, as an archaeologist, I think this is important about archaeology, how archaeologists get their information. Evidently, if repeat visits are anything to go by, those millions of people thoroughly enjoyed themselves. It conjured up to me in this year of the Festival of Ideas, the idea of exploring all that first, and then looking behind at the ideas that it has sparked. Well, you all know that York is a wonderful historic place. I got the right one, yes, there we go, with incredible wealth of ancient monuments from the Roman period, pretty well to yesterday, and that it's a place still with a vigorous commercial life and a tremendously vibrant development tradition. And sometimes those features do clash. Development can impede the work, or well, not impede, but destroy the evidence on which the archaeologists would base their search for the whole story of York. And I suppose, looking for the origins of the ideas behind Jorvik, probably goes back to a time in 1972, I think it was, thereabouts. It was a time when Lord Esher had told us how large areas of the city should be redeveloped to bring it back into vibrancy and conserve it, without any so much as a word of the archaeology that it was going to destroy. The city was hell-bent on having an inner ring road. Look at it there, smashing through Blossom Street and whizzing across a bridge to the southeast and roundabouts here and this, that and the other everywhere. And there were all sorts of other threats. Now, this was a time when the country was waking up to the idea that the nation's history was very much at risk in the face of modern development. Gravel pits destroying great areas of the landscapes, ancient landscapes, new roads. The A5, I think, went through 120 archaeological sites. And there was a feeling that something needed to be done. And people in York felt that about this oncoming holocaust, really, of disturbance of the archaeological layers. And so that is the first idea, the first big idea. Let's set up an archaeological trust. They did, and I was lucky enough to be appointed its director and began work in 1972 with a ad hoc team. First thing we hit in the middle of town was a complete Roman sewerage system running from Church Street along the Swine Gate for quite a long distance, full of Roman stuff that got down the loo, as it were. People lost their rings, lost their amulets, goodness knows what down there, even their sponges, you know what they use those for. And it became a 9-day wonder. And so, is it any wonder that the little badge on the top right-hand corner was presented to me for my first appearance on Blue Peter? The nation were very interested, or was very interested. And this wasn't the only site. There was another one not very far away on the corner of Piccadilly and Pavement. Lloyd's Bank. Lloyd's Bank is still there. It didn't come down. It wasn't rebuilt. But the bank decided it put in new vaults. And I thought, well, the vaults will go down into the archaeological layers. So I remember going to the bank manager and saying, excuse me, sir, did you know you've got some very interesting deposits in your vaults? And he thought it was a joke, and eventually became very enthusiastic. To get a long story short, 11 feet of buried archaeological deposits of the Viking Age turned up in the excavations under the Lloyd's Bank corner. It was a particularly outstanding piece of work because the layers were waterlogged, and so organic materials survived, and we were apparently in an old Viking Age leather manufacturing shop with various bits of leather making gear, offcuts from making shoes and boots and so on, quite a lot of boots and shoes as well, and 1,000 other things, including those of you who would not want me to pass on without mentioning it tonight, the famous Viking turd. So it really was an amazing thing. And there were more other sites. I think there must have been 20 sites we were rushing around digging in those years. And it all cost money. And we'd raised quite a lot of money locally. But really the funders were the Ministry of Works. And I remember a day when the Chief Inspector of the Ministry of Works came up. I used to know him quite well. We used to drink together in another excavation in Devonshire years ago. Peter, he said, you can't go on like this. We've got enormous numbers of challenges. You've got to prioritise. We really ought to choose something that's really worth doing for British archaeology and for British history. Now, at that time, I had already appointed a very brilliant young man who was a specialist in Viking archaeology. We had just excavated this Viking site under Lloyd's Bank, and both Andrew Saunders, the Chief Inspector, and I thought, well, if we could find a large site where we could do an extensive excavation of layers like the ones under Lloyd's Bank, this would be a major contribution to British history because, well, towns sort of petered away at the end of the Roman period, and yet there were many of them flourishing by the Norman period, and at some time in that very long period of time, towns reawakened, and there's a very good chance that in York they reawakened with the beginning of the Viking Age. So Andrew said, well, right, okay, if it's a big site, and one came along, it was for the whole of that enormous Coppergate development. And yes, he said, okay, well, prioritise that, you know. And, I managed to persuade the city council officials to let us into the site, to demolish it early and test it. And our clever Richard Hall, the brilliant archaeology student, came up with the most amazing standing structure. It was about 6 feet high, and it was a Viking house. In fact, there were two of them side by side, one on one long plot, one on the other long plot, exactly under where the modern buildings had stood, i.e. the Vikings laid out Coppergate with its division into plots, and it hasn't changed in 1,000 years. So this was very exciting, and The ministry thought, yes, very good, and we thought, well, that's all very well. We've been working on lots of other sites. Here's one on the corner of Museum Street and Lendal, a Roman interval tower. And we had a whole variety of other things at our beck and call. But young Richard Hall here, as you see him, is quite just got his PhD when we took him on. And there we are in those very early levels at Coppergate. And Richard, in fact, stuck with that for most of the rest of his life, and indeed managed to publish this huge series of volumes on his work there before, very much older and much greyer, but still a charming sort of guy. He finished his career when he sadly died. But what an achievement for Richard, because it was a huge excavation right in the middle of York. There's Coppergate in the background there, and you see crowds looking on because we opened it to the public. And you see in the foreground more crowds, but these are archaeology students. And some of them now actually are professors of archaeology in places like Lund and Sheffield and goodness knows where else, where they learnt their dirt archaeology and never forgot their work on Coppergate. But it was a very popular thing, and we found that we could actually charge people to go in, which was a little bit of a contribution to the huge amounts of money that were needed for it. You can see around the edge of that there is a sort of steel piling. Well, we had to put that in. And I remember when we got an estimate for it, my lovely chairman, Professor Maurice Barley from the University of Nottingham, said, £78,000, Peter. And this was in 1972. That's enough to run my department for 10 years. And I said, yes, well, we've got to get it. And, well, we started on a fundraising campaign. And who better to lead that but a well-known figure from television. Then he was the chairman of Mastermind. Mastermind's still going. Sadly, Magnuson has passed on, but Magnus was in town filming, and our fundraiser said, do you think you could get him to do it? I thought, well, he's sort of interested in archaeology. And I found out where he was having his morning coffee with the television crew. I popped round there and happened to buy and said, Magnus, have you seen the Viking houses that we're excavating in Coppergate? Oh, no, he said, no, seriously. So we went down there, oh, this is wonderful. And I thought, hooked him. Indeed, he then said, yes, I'd love to lead your fundraising campaign for this wonderful excavation of my ancestors. And of course, he was as good as his word. Magnus knew everybody. He happened to know the equerry to the Prince of Wales, who was a great friend. And so said equerry, contacted the Prince of Wales and said, you've got a degree in archaeology, sir. There's a big dig going on in York that needs your help. Well, indeed it did. And it also was the beginning of a major fundraising campaign and a huge series of excavations that produced the results that we perhaps know about. One thing Magnus did, quite by accident actually. He did a late-night program on the wonderful work at Coppergate, on a late-night television program. And somebody over in Lancashire saw it. This gentleman here, Ian Skipper. And Ian rang up next day. Is that Mr. Addyman? And I guess, yes, he got hold of me. Must have been in the office because I didn't have a mobile in those days. I want to go and see your dig. I saw it on the television last night. And I said, oh, well, yeah, of course. When would that be? Well, today. And I said, well, where are you? He said, Lancashire. And I said, oh, I'll just come straight across in the car. Well, he turned up and it was a Rolls Royce. And it had a lovely lady in it, his wife, and two absolutely charming young daughters in very, very posh clothing. They went and looked and said, oh, can I go down there? And I said, no, I don't think so. Polished shoes and all that. Did uttered a rude word about that. And he said, I'm going down there anyway. And down they went. And he became absolutely convinced that this was something that was an outrage, that the archaeology was being destroyed by this new shopping centre that the city was determined to have, and something ought to be done about it. And he said, "Oh, all these people." And I said, "Well, we charged them £1 to go in." "Yes," he said, and well, it's a shocking-looking mess, this site. It needs clearing up. I'll tell you what, I'll send my team over. Well, the team turned up, and they put up that lovely hoarding at the end that you see there. It painted it an incredible sort of sub-Viking interlaced ornament. It put huge signs, and you can see one on the left there on the buildings on either side saying, "The Viking Dig." We'd called it the archaeological excavations at Coppergate, but the Viking Dig. And, well, what are we going to sell them? I said, "Well, perhaps a little guidebook." And he said, "Well, I'm not sure they want that." "Can't we sell the finds?" No, we can't. He said, "You must have something you can sell them." And I said, "We've got about 20,000 oyster shells, so we're very keen on late night suppers of oysters in Viking Age York, and we really don't need more than a few, do we?" He said, "Right, we'll sell them £1 each." We sold 20,000. Well, Ian Skipper put us on the road to being commercial, and bless his heart, developed it with Magnus's good friends, like the equerry to the Prince of Wales, bringing Prince Charles to the excavation. There he is, visiting the site with Richard Hall, and Magnus then took it one step further and said to the Prince, "Would you care to chair the fundraising committee?" "I don't really do that," said the Prince, "but maybe we could get a little team together." He said, didn't Queen Margareta also read archaeology at Cambridge? I read archaeology at Cambridge. He read archaeology. "Yes," I said, "that's three of us, isn't it?" "Yes," he said. So I think, let's get the royals. There's some young royals in Norway, I think. So there they are in the next one. The Crown Prince of Norway wasn't terribly interested in archaeology, but his lovely wife there was. And so that solved that problem. "Yes, I'll join," he said. I'd been at a conference on which I'd met the President of Iceland, who happened to be a former director of the Icelandic National Museum. So I knew him. I gave him a ring. "Yes, I'll join." So we had heads of state, or potential heads of state, as our fundraising team, chaired by the Prince of Wales. And so money eventually began to roll. Royal patrons visit Coppergate, and the rest, well, I wouldn't say it's history, but it was certainly very good archaeology. Here you see a site of two of those long tenements that run back from Coppergate. In the one on the front, there's a big red area, which is the central hearth in the middle of one of these long Viking houses. Then there's a chap in blue cleaning up the posts of the walls of that building, not quite so well preserved as the ones that we've seen above. Then behind that, there's another wall, a line of little posts, and then, if you can just see it in the background, another of those red things, another hearth. So here you've got this picture of what Viking Coppergate was like in the 10th century, with these identical buildings laid out at right angles to Coppergate on exactly the same layout as the modern boundaries between the properties that had stood there in 1972. Wow! So who was it then who created the rebirth of towns in Britain? Well, the Vikings, and no doubt an extremely good town planner of some sort, certainly did it in this case. This is the sort of preservation that some of the buildings had. They're standing up to 6 feet high, planked walls, upright posts, all sorts of details inside them. Something that had never really been found in Britain before, and certainly of this quality, and certainly in this extent, an enormous area excavation. How about that? A really stunning piece of Viking architecture still standing there in the ground. And so the work was so successful that it got not only local interest, the press of course was fascinated by it, but national press. Magnus had an article in the Illustrated London News about the discovery of Viking York, a rather nice illustrated one, colour one. And then Politiken and Aftenposten and various other Scandinavian newspapers got hold of it, Denmark's radio, which has a good, strong tradition in archaeology, sent across its favourite announcer, and he was absolutely bowled over by what he did, came back several times, and every Dane knew what was going on. Well, there's one Dane that I knew, I knew would know what was going on, and it was Queen Margareta, because she was in the same class as I was at Cambridge. And yes, she was willing to support it. So she actually came and visited, and she then introduced me to one or two influential people in Denmark who put up a lot of the money for the rest of the excavation. It's an incredibly effective little group of royal supporters that made much of this work possible. Well, what came from it? 5 years of excavation. Those wet conditions preserving everything from, turds, as I mentioned before, the beetles, insects, I think there was a squashed beehive, there was everything that you could expect that might be in and around a busy town centre in the 10th century and the 9th century. Yes, here's some shoes. I suppose some of those might have come from the Lloyd's Bank excavation, but quite large numbers also came from the Coppergate excavations. And, there's several styles there, aren't there? You're beginning to actually have a sort of fashion story for Viking Age York. And something like this. What are they? Well, on the left is a punch for making coins. It's got a rounded bottom end, and on that is engraved the image that is going to go on one side of the coin, and there would be an anvil underneath with the image of the other side showing up. You would put a piece of silver, between the two, and bang, you made yourself a coin. This moneyer was obviously working on Coppergate, because he had not only two redundant stamps there, the one on the left and the broken one with a chip out of it in the middle, but he'd got some trial pieces in lead where he'd been trying out other stamps. Well, numismatists went wild. This is the sort of evidence that they've always hoped for, actually, to see some of the work behind the coins that are so often found from the Viking Age and later. And eventually we had 39,500 small objects of one sort or another, one huge mass of data about everyday life in Viking York. It started sometime in the 860s, and it went on with occasional interludes with English kings, and eventually English kings, of course, taking over right until the Norman invasion. Historians often said that monk at Romsey Abbey, who said there were 20,000 people in York, must have been talking out of his hat. No town at that place was as big as that. Well, if you think of the number of places that have the same layout in terms of streets and property definitions throughout York, it very well could be true. Certainly 10,000, probably more. Right, said Ian. It's a success. I told you I'd make you profitable. And then the day came when we had to hand it back to the city for development. And he said, well, can't we keep it going? And I said, no, this is what archaeologists do. They dig the sites, hand them back, and then they're developed. He said, we should develop it ourselves. I said, no, don't do that. Well, I do, he said. He had 70 garages in his control, so he knew a little bit about this. And to cut a very long story short, we did actually put in a scheme, along with all the other schemes, for the Coppergate development to the city council. And it didn't pass. I remember Roy Howell, the lovely town clerk at the time, and I knew him very well. I said, oh, Roy, for goodness sakes. And he said, look, I didn't advise you to do this. And I said, I thought you said it was possible. It's few sewers, he said. we shan't look sympathetically at your next scheme. I said, all right, okay. Well, if you're going to re-advertise the whole thing, we'll have another go. I got an architect in London, a very distinguished architect, and Roy had said it'll never happen on the site. You know, you'll have to have a museum somewhere nearby. So we had this brilliant building designed on the only we built it on the castle car park. It got an award for being the best designed Britain building in York for decades, and the city council gave this contract to the present developers. And I went to Roy and said, "Oh, Roy, look, we did what you said, and now look what's happened." He said, "Have you listened and seen what they've proposed?" And I said, "No, not really." He said, "Well, they proposed to have a museum underground, and that's your thing, isn't it?" And I said, "Yes, okay, right, we'll cooperate with the developers." And that's the long story short. That was an idea that Ian Skipper had had, a big idea. And after a bit of coming and going, it happened. So there is what was built, with the shops above, which you recognise now and love, no doubt, and the Viking Centre underneath. Ian reckoned that it wouldn't run if it wasn't publicised, and he knew a bit about that too. And so amongst the various things we did were to produce a logo. I'm wearing a badge, a little Jorvik Eric Bloodaxe badge tonight, and there is the same image on your screen. We had a very skillful group of promoters promoting the idea of a museum, and not an idea of a museum, of a Viking display. And our friend Ian Skipper said, "Right, what sort of a thing is it to be, Peter?" And I said, "Well, gosh, I don't know. We could put the buildings back down there." And he said, "They're a bit boring, aren't they?" And I said, "Well," he said, "couldn't you just do a reconstruction of what it was like?" And to put it a long story short, we had a competition, and the blessings on us, John Sunderland and some colleagues put together a new company that offered to do a film set of what Jorvik had been like, through which you went in a little car, and you could be guaranteed to have your visitors looking exactly where you wanted them to look, because the little car would turn this way and that, and you could dress your view expensively and forget all the rest. Who cares what happened behind the buildings? And you could have people actually feeling that they'd been there. Right? There were various other suggestions, and many of them conventional museums, but this is what we decided to go for. It's a bit of a risk, because these guys had no company record, just a brilliant designer, a brilliant organizer, and a brilliant operations manager. And they produced not quite that thing, but they produced that. And some of you will remember, as you went backwards in time through a tunnel of time, from the present through the Victorian period and the Georgian period and the Middle Ages, and then you emerged and the car stopped and turned, and Magnuson's voice said, "Time has stopped." Can't do his accent. "History of frozen. This is Jorvik." And then your little car went down that central alleyway, past all these people doing their stuff, and it went into the house on the left, and it went round by the dock at the bottom end, and then it turned the corner into, good heavens, an archaeological dig of the 1970s, in which the remains of all this were set out. Well, it was quite an unusual way of interpreting the past, but it turned out that a ride in a time car was something that could not be resisted. I took various people down. The head of the British Museum, Sir David Wilson, I knew him quite well, thought it was a bit tasteless and awful, and we went through it, and sneering. I know him well, I love him dearly, but he is a sneerer. And at the end he said, why was the thatch like that? And I said, well, it's the thatch we found in the Oh, you found thatch, did you? And I said, yes. And he said, are they all thatched like that? And I said, well, possibly. We only did one or two slate. Oh, yes, that's very interesting, isn't it? Yes, I suppose they would have been. What was that big black bird then? And I said, oh, it's a raven. A raven, he said. Why'd you put a raven in it? I said, well, we found raven bird bones. Oh. Now, that's interesting, isn't it? Because there's that incident in the life of Edwin in which he crosses the square in York and he's met by a big bird and he thinks it's a bad omen and so he changes his decision. I said, yes, there were ravens around in York and that. Yes, he said, I hadn't, yes, that was interesting. I said, David, you've just been through and learned two new things about Viking York that even you didn't know. Yes, he said, well, I suppose there's some merit in it. Time cars went on for many years and they eventually, bless them, managed to clock up 75,000 miles. They were built by one of Mr. Skipper's company. He was in motor engineering. But after that, they were clapped out. And at that time, so was a lot of the rest of looking a little bit tired. And it was suggested that perhaps it needed a refurb. And a major refurb took place. We found that we had to have a smooth runway for the time cars to go on, so somebody hit on the idea of putting people in chariots suspended from the roof. And you can see one of those in the next. There we are. And not only that, you could get 6 people in a chariot from the roof, not just 4. And you could have more people going through. And that meant you could dress the road as a rough old road was, not have it as smooth as a baby's backside. And it was also able to twist your car around so you could look in various directions. Wow. It was a bright idea, but how do you get that? Well, it just happened to be the time when all the mines in West Yorkshire were closing down, and there were all sorts of redundant mine transporting engineers who knew all about cars suspended from roofs and twisting around. And we had a team from them who designed the first town cars hanging from the roof. And there we are, people having a lovely time in what was now completely rebuilt and redesigned set of settings, designed basically on the results of the research that dear Richard Hall and his team had been carrying out on the archaeological dig records itself. So the more time went by, the more we knew about Viking York, and the more we could tell people and create it for subliminal understanding. You don't have to be told this is an X or that is a Y. You don't have to have dusty labels and glass cases. If you've seen it and you've seen how it works, you know it. You don't have to be told it. And it was a very powerful way of educating. I remember first time we took Commander Saunders Watson down there. He was chairman of the Curriculum Development Council. He said, this is absolutely what schools have been wanting. And I said, oh, I'm glad you think that's and he said, you know, for the subject of the Vikings, this could not be a better place. And I said, well, that is true, but the subject of the Vikings is not in the national curriculum. What? It's not in the I'm sure it must be. And he sent me a letter a couple of days later saying, you're right, it's not there, but it soon will be. and as a result, what happens? We had to restrict schools to one every 14 minutes, because if they were any closer, the first school kids got mixed up with the second school kids. There had to be 14 minutes gap, or you had chaos. It was quite extraordinary. They came from Cornwall and Devon. They even came from Shetland. And it was an educational success. Well, as I've said, the Prince of Wales opened it in was it the 12th of No, the 17th of June, so we're just about the 40th anniversary of his opening. It's already been open a little bit before that. He was absolutely delighted with it. I'm on the left there, slightly better preserved version. The man in the middle is good dear Professor Maurice Barley, the man who said, you're spending more than my archaeology department spends in 7 years. And there is the prince looking at a building on the other side. Should I tell you this story? I'm not sure. What's that building? He said. And I said, oh, it's a multi-story car park. Oh, looks like a Spanish jail. Anyway, the architect who was standing next to him managed to swallow hard, and the prince went off to talk to some ladies up the road. And he was not the only one. The site became a 9-day wonder. I remember going out on the first day it opened with Magnus Magnusson and John Sunderland, the wonderful designer who came up with the innards. And we sat in the office there just above that red sign and thought, will anybody come? And looked out, and there they were, 10 o'clock on that morning, round the square. And there they continued to be, round the square, for weeks and weeks and weeks. All sorts of wonderful and distinguished people came. We usually made quite sure we looked after them very well and took them round specially, of course, not made them queue. However, time went by and Magnus, who got all sorts of wonderful accolades, was given an honorary knighthood. You can't give an Icelander a real knighthood, but you can give him an honorary one, and it was to be given by Sir Malcolm Rifkind in the Edinburgh Castle. And I got an invitation to go, so that'd be rather nice. And I went up, and I didn't know anybody up there really, but Sir Malcolm came up and said, oh, who are you? And I said, oh, I'm Peter Addyman from the Viking Centre, you know, the Magnus. I said, oh, yes, he said, I've been there. And I said, have you? Yes, he said, yes, it's wonderful, it's wonderful. My little boy went with his school, and he came back and he said, Daddy, Saturday, we've got to go down to York. I want to show the Viking Centre. So we got on the train, we went down, and do you know, there was a queue going right round the square and out into the street at the far end. I said, you didn't queue to get in, didn't? He said, oh, I wouldn't want to pull rank. No, he said, I quite enjoyed it. I quite enjoyed the queue. And people do. We'd learned that in Disney World when we went to consult them about this sort of thing. They said, oh, queue's half the battle. People love queues. As long as they move and there's things to do, they love queuing. And so they did. And there they are. 1985, 897,290 people queued for that. Wow. In 1989, 909,400. We never quite made 1 million, but we made an awful lot of people. And yes, it dropped off as it became a little bit of yesterday's news, but an incredible effect in a whole range of ways. For one thing, what did Mr. Skipper say? I'll make you profitable. Ooh, yes, he did that. Well, the British Institute of Advertising recognised the success when they saw it and gave it the National Award for the best advertised small company in Britain. Ooh, that's a first for an archaeology outfit. And so on and so forth, it went on. And, well, we didn't stop there. It was a success, but we felt that there were other ways in which we could help the nation in its hopefully growing love of archaeology. I've always remembered this Chinese proverb: I hear and I forget. I see and I remember. Now, you've all seen that, you're all remembering, aren't you? Yeah, no doubt of that. But I do, and I understand. Well, yes, how can we follow that up? Well, my manager, the wonderful Anthony Gaynor, Major Gaynor, who ran the Jorvik project and built it and managed it, came along one day to me and said, not many visitors in February. And I said, no, there wouldn't be, would there? He said, it needn't be so. Do you know, the Scottish half term is a different half term to the English half term. And if we could get all the kids in the schools to come on those two half terms, that's almost all of February. We'd fill it in February. So we had a Viking festival. I didn't want one, but Anthony insisted. And, well, amongst other things, all sorts of fun took place. We had invasions of Viking warriors from Scandinavia who came in their boats, for goodness sake, and raced up the river. The English boats got nowhere at all, but the Danes and Norwegians knew how to do these things. And thousands of people in the middle of February came to York to see a Viking festival. Oh, dear. They wouldn't have had it in July. We've got far too many visitors then already. But this business of I do and I remember, and we hit on the idea of capitalizing on the new interest that these schools and people had in archaeology by developing a centre where they could actually do things. The leader of that particular team is in the audience tonight, Andrew Jones, and we'll remember very well the idea of turning St Saviour's Church into two levels, putting a series of research labs on the first floor, which we had to build, and then having on the ground floor a place where kids could come and interface with archaeology. So there we are, kids on the right interfacing with archaeology, and that bird's eye view of them on all these little areas where you could touch the past, you could hold history in your hand, you could look at, what is it, a bone? It's a horse jaw. I think it's a horse jaw. It's a what? Cow, sorry. Well, I'm not a zoologist, damn it. But anyhow, there is an example, and here's some more. Looking down from up above, the bottom of right, on the top right, you can see the research labs by the window. But looking down from up there, you get kids with Andrew or somebody like him in the middle, absolutely mesmerising them by telling them about bugs and slugs. And up on the top left, they're doing their own little dig and finding skeletons. In the middle, some young lady is trying to work out what this small specimen of pottery is. Looks like an archaeologist in training, that one. And other ones at the bottom looking through microscopes. So what a wonderful place. It actually is an exemplification of that Confucian saying, I do and I understand. There's St Saviour's, a wonderful church, renowned and full of rubbish. No, it wasn't full of rubbish, it was full of scenery from the theatre. That was not rubbish, but we did move that out anyway, and it now becomes, and it still is, a very much popular, attended other attraction, not a great money spinner, but one which has huge effect in terms of educational value and general worth. Well, how many bright ideas have we had since now? You know, Ian Skipper's ideas and Magnus's ideas, and now somebody's ideas for the Jorvik dig, and Andrew Jones's ideas on how to run a place like that. Big idea after big idea after big idea. And for a festival and ideas, we're doing quite well at the moment. However, nothing ventured, nothing gained. I did find that this place in Coffee Yard was in a ruinous state, had been bought by a very nice local entrepreneur who was going to turn it into offices. It was an old wreck. It really was a sort of Victorian old wreck to look at. But I found, and I knew, in fact, from the Royal Commission's wonderful reports, that it contained massive structures of medieval buildings. So I went to see the developer and said, look, must you? And he was very nice. His Richard Wood, his father had been a Lord Mayor and all that kind of thing. So very much a York man. He said, I'll do a deal. If you get me the money for it, that I paid for it, I'll let you have it and you can do what you like with it. Well, that meant raising money. So Robert Hardy, do you remember Robert Hardy? He used to films and so on, the television, expert on medieval archery. I thought we needed a Magnus for Barley Hall, and he knew all about medieval life. So Robert Hardy became the face of Barley Hall, And this is what we ended up with, which you now know and love, and that's what it looks like inside. Well, it looks a lot better than that now, but what you see there is a hearth in the middle of the open hall, which had been restored. The hearth is medieval. We found it in an excavation out near the Ring Road, on the other side of Clifton, in a medieval house that we excavated there, so we brought it in. The tiles, they look a bit ritzy, don't they, for a medieval house? But no, we did find red, yellow and black tiles, and in that sort of layout. So there we are, replica tiles. What else? Well, most of the pots are based on ones that we've excavated. Furniture, had to go for surviving medieval furniture in museums for that. Some of the decorations, though, were actually recorded in wills of people who lived either in this house or nearby. So we know they had wall coverings of that sort. And another way then of introducing the present to the past. And here are schools enjoying visits in Roll. Down on the right, those kids doing various cooking. And will they ever forget it? Those kids now must be young adults or middle-aged. But I bet they don't forget that. So, that was the brilliant idea that we have an archaeological dig in York, that we work on the Coppergate site for the reasons aforementioned, that we turn it into an underground museum. No, not a museum. I once reviewed a book in which the young researcher got his PhD for studying museums, and he sent out 1,000 questionnaires, and about 7 came back saying, what do you feel about museums? So a carefully selected scientific section of the country. Well, not to be put off, he thought, right, I'll go and talk to them, knocked on their door and see, I sent you a questionnaire. Yeah, yes, we used it for the toilet paper. Well, could you just answer it? What do you think about museums? Oh, boring. Took us around them when we were kids, lots of glass cases, just this. So he wrote all these things down. And that book shows that really most people think museums are a bit sort of yawn-worthy. Well, I read that book, and it was one of the things that inspired me in pushing all this through in the trust. It also inspired Mr. Skipper, and he said, well, we've done it here, let's do it elsewhere. And I said, sorry, I'm the director of the trust. No. He said, well, I'm setting a company to do it. It's going to be called Heritage Projects, and you're on it. And well, there is Heritage Projects, meeting in a little hotel near Malton for one of its board meetings. And right in the middle, the tallest of them all, is Major Anthony Gaynor, Eternal now Anthony Gaynor, who was the first director of the Viking Centre. He knew all about that. On his beside him on one side is Colin Pyra, who set up a company that built Jorvik. On the other side is a financial wizard on Ian Skipper's payroll. There's me on the left there. On the right, there's Jan Podlewski, who ran a fantastically successful shop in Jorvik. Then at the bottom, little lad at the bottom, is the chap who designed the first Jorvik, John Sunderland, still with us very happily, now retired in Spain, and Phoebe MacLeod, who organised the making of all those displays that you once saw. And Skipper said, right, we're calling it Heritage Projects. I'll be I'll be the owner of the company, but Anthony can run it, and you can all go and build these things elsewhere. And I said, well, if the trust will let me. Oh, well. Anyhow, the first that came along is this. Funny thing, it's in Kiev. And the Ministry of something or other, information or something, came along and said, we were thinking of having a British a month in Kiev. We wanted to sort of tell people who don't know much about life in the West what it's like. Could you do a sort of Jorvik on modern Britain? So yes, We did a Boots, Timothy White's, we did a shoe shop, a dress shop. We had a family that had a dog and two children and a mum and dad, and they had a little semi-detached house. And the thousands of people queued for hours to get into this place to see what life was like in an ordinary British town. Wow, just the Jorvik stuff, but taken to the 20th century. And yes, when we closed it down, poor poverty-stricken folk queued in enormous queues to buy the props, like soap and talcum powder and stuff that they couldn't get. Amazing. Another absolutely bizarre thing, I remember it well, the Vice-Chancellor of the University of Oxford is on the phone and wants to talk to you. What? Right, I'll talk to him. I've been to your thing at Jorvik, and I said, oh, have you? Yes, he said, yes. We have a problem here in Oxford, you know. And I said, do you? He said, it's tourists, they're everywhere. They come in all the quads and now. We can't control them. I just wondered if there was the sort of chance of you doing a kind of Oxford story that would keep them off the pavements. Well, there was a chance, and there is the gateway to the Oxford story. It lasted 20 years, and then the college that owned that property sold it, and we had to close it. But I didn't think it was terribly successful, but it did allow ordinary people to learn about the very complex and extremely long history of the University of Oxford, that other place. Along came my friends, the archaeologists from Canterbury, and said, Peter, I'm really jealous of your thing in Jorvik. I wonder if you could do one for Canterbury. And we said, well, what have you got in Canterbury that we could? And he said, oh, I don't know, what would you do? I said, well, people all know about Canterbury because of the Canterbury pilgrims, don't they? And nothing else. No, he said, we've got a lovely cathedral. I said, well, we're not doing a cathedral. Okay, we'll have a go. And we found a church and turned it into the Canterbury Pilgrim's Way. There's the advertising for it, and there's one of the scenes for the Canterbury Tales, but using data from the archaeological excavations in Canterbury with the cooperation of the Canterbury Archaeological Trust. It lasted for 30 years as well. And these were all very successful business operations. And we got a reputation for being the people to come to when you had a big tourist attraction to run. So what happens next? Portsmouth Corporation turn up. We've just built a Spinnaker Tower to celebrate the millennium. And you can go up it, but we don't know how to run it. Simple, we said, we'll run it for you. And so another outcome of the Jorvik Viking Centre has been the team that has run the Spinnaker Tower. And it's that company that Ian set up, the Heritage Projects, is now called Continuum and still exists in York. Continuum, in fact, is very often in the top 100 profitable companies in York. It's even got an attraction in York, the Chocolate Story. And it's got a whole... I used to be a non-executive director. They didn't pay me anything, but I went along as a sort of, you can't do that, it's tasteless kind of thing, or no, that's historically incorrect. And Mr. Skipper would say, really, Peter, I would love to do that. And I said, well, you can't. So that was my role. Ban it if it was awful. But the Spinnaker Tower, a wonderful thing. And Continuum Attractions, as I say, continues to attract. It has, in Oxford, a sort of sequel to the Oxford story, taken over Oxford Castle. And Oxford Castle, in fact, can now be visited, courtesy of the Continuum team. It's got the wonderful early medieval tower, of course. You can go up that. It's a bit of a climb. Not much we can do about interpreting that. But nearby is the old prison. And by gosh, that's fun. You can go through a prison, you can be a prisoner, etc. So that works. Then along came the Corporation of Edinburgh. And they said, we've got a bit of a problem in Edinburgh. We've got a site. It's below the old Exchange building that's been sort of covered up since the 18th century. We wondered whether you could make something of it. It's quite near St Giles's Church on the Royal Mile. It's called Mary King's Close, because Mary King lived in it in the 18th century, and then it was closed and decked over so they could build the Royal Exchange on a flat site in this otherwise very steeply sloping landscape. And it's all still there. We said, right, we better go and have a look. And it was. It's all still there. This is approximately what it might have looked like on the left. This is what it looks like nowadays. And courtesy of Continuum, bless its heart, you can go down there and you can live the life that Mary King lived in the 18th century with the usual forms of interpretation that you've already been hearing about elsewhere. And look at this, very dramatic. And we've found it's so effective, this presentation, that people, as they come through that doorway, often pass out. It's so atmospheric. A dozen of them have done it. In fact, we now have to have a costumed interpreter standing there, ready to catch them. Yep, it's true. It's quite an extraordinarily effective place. It's so effective that it got the award of being Scotland's top tourist attraction. So there's another son of Jorvik that's done its work, using some of the techniques that you've been hearing about. I couldn't believe it. I could not believe they were going to take on the Loch Ness Exhibition Centre. Luckily, I had just resigned as a non-executive director. But I believe it's very successful, and no one's seen the Loch Ness Monster yet, but a lot of people are getting a better presentation of a very interesting, I mean, everybody knows it all over the world, so you've got to have something there, haven't you? You really have. And you might as well have something that's decent and really puts all the facts and the possibilities and the legends and everything else across in an effective way. And that's what we do. Right, well, that's an awful lot of sons of Jorvik. And the other aspect is that the teams that built Jorvik were trained up to do skills that hadn't not hitherto really been available. And when the site was finished, two companies developed. The first one you've heard about, Continuum, that was going to build visitor centres of one sort or another. We have them in Wales, we have them in the south, all over the place these days. The other lot were the technical experts who built the contents of Jorvik. People who could make, I don't know, Viking costumes, or could make ancient buildings, or could reproduce pottery or textile, or whatever it might be. And there were quite a lot of them, about 20, I think, of them, who had worked on Jorvik. What do you do when you finish? Not another job like that, is there? So Colin Pyra set up Paragon Creative and established it on the aerodrome out at, on the way to, what's it called? Elvington Aerodrome. It lasted for 20 years. It had 120 employees, and Paragon Creative kept people like this at work. Now, this young lady is a sculptress, and she's sculpting one of the generation, they don't have them now, but a generation of figures in the Jorvik Centre that were actually based on Viking Age skulls. We found that there's an outfit in Glasgow University that hit on a way of taking an ancient skull, scanning it, computer scanning it, and then applying known pluses and minuses for thickness and thinness of fleshly parts and so on, and getting something like a likeness of the person involved. Well, we used that in Jorvik, so there were, in one of the iterations of Jorvik, about 10 of these people who probably looked a bit like the people who we'd found. And this young lady was an expert at making that. But there were experts in all sorts of other things, and they became very successful. That's a list of all the clients that they had up to 2015. And interestingly enough, they weren't just in Loch Ness or Edinburgh or Portsmouth or Canterbury. We're all over the world. And this little map, these two maps, show the sort of effect, the ideas that went behind Jorvik and the ideas that generated the way that Jorvik worked have been applied elsewhere. HPL, Heritage Projects Limited, are red, and they are, well, you can see the one in Kiev over there somewhere in Russia, can't you? I can't remember what the blue one, the blue one was something to do with holograms, yes, that's right. And there were various other ones where they were employed, including Portsmouth and Canterbury. You can see them there. PFL, well, the trust itself thought, what are these people doing, getting all this business? And it set up a little business that made consultancies. And I remember going on one of them to Zimbabwe, believe it or not, where Mugabe thought tourism was something that he ought to develop and wanted advice on tourist sites. And he and eventually Dominic Tweddle, the co-director of the Archaeological Trust, worked there. And, well, you can see what's the other one, ideas, yes, scenic route, yes, there were 1, 2, 3, 4 companies that were operating and providing services, paid services, and there's PVA at the bottom. Well, I found that, people came and said, can I see the director? Yes. I've just come to pick your brains. Yes, well, I work how have you done what? Yes, okay, can I help? What is your problem? And after a bit, I felt my brains had been picked bare. But various international organisations decided that the status would be turned into reverse. And down there in Sri Lanka, I had my brains picked courtesy of an international company that wanted to give advice on the historic sites of Sri Lanka. I also had my brains picked by Mugabe and his friends too. I'm a black one down there, and I can't remember where else I went. Not too many, but even I found myself going off on this post-Jorvik, Sons of Jorvik adventure. Well, there it is, Jorvik Viking Centre, 40 years on, with a visitor attendance approaching 25 million, with income which makes archaeology in York something that is now paid for and doesn't have to be begged for to the Ministry of Works or whatever they are these days. And it's a place where you've enjoyed it. You wouldn't have come tonight, I don't think, if you hadn't. I don't think there's anybody in the room who's not been round. No. You've all been round. Well, that just says it, doesn't it? And I rest my case. Big ideas, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, still going strong. And, well, there's nothing like having a good idea. Thank you.